Welcome to the Rochester, New Hampshire History Podcast, a monthly show that will shine a light on a piece of history that has been all but forgotten.
There were over 10,000 battles in the American Civil War, including some of the most important battles in the country's history, such as Gettysburg, Shiloh, and Vicksburg. The war was fought in 23 different states and resulted in the death of more than 620,000 men. By the war's end in 1865, there were 2.5 million surviving veterans of the war. By the early 1900s, the number of surviving Civil War veterans had dwindled to 1 million. By the 1930s, the Civil War veterans were aging, and though they had survived the violence of the battlefield, there was no escaping Father Time. By the 1940s, the vast majority of Civil War soldiers had passed on. In 1956, Albert Woolson, America's last Civil War veteran, died in Minnesota. Rochester's last Civil War veteran was Charles Brackett, and thanks to a March 16, 1934 edition of the Rochester Courier, we know a little bit about his life. In that newspaper, there is an article about Charles' 64th wedding anniversary and a short biography of him.
He was born in Somersworth, New Hampshire, on September 11, 1844. At the start of the Civil War in 1861, he enlisted in the 4th New Hampshire Infantry as a musician. During the American Civil War, armies relied on musicians to entertain troops and, more importantly, position troops in battle, sometimes actually performing concerts near combat in hopes of boosting morale. Charles was stationed at various places in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida until April 1864. Afterward, he saw service in Virginia and North Carolina.
Charles was wounded several times, but not disabled. He was mustered out of the Army on August 23, 1865 at Raleigh, North Carolina. After the war, he moved to Rochester and worked in the Wallace Shoe Shop as the manager of the healing department. On March 12, 1870, he married Miss Clara Howard. In later years, Charles quit the shoe shop, and by 1920 was working as a janitor at the Maple Street School, where his daughter, Mrs. Ida B. Meter, was a teacher. He worked 16 years at the school and retired only due to ill health.
The newspaper also reported that even though he is 89 years old, he walked daily down street for his newspaper and walks with a firm, erect step. Charles was a charter member of Sampson Post, number 22, Grand Army of the Republic. This was a fraternal organization composed of veterans of Union soldiers and sailors who served in the Civil War. A little over 2 years later, the June 5, 1936 Rochester Courier reported that the Memorial Day celebration would include a large parade, exercises at City Hall, the Common, and Rochester Cemetery. There was a bit of bad news, though, and it involved Charles Brackett.
A Memorial Day tradition in Rochester was that a Civil War soldier would recite the Gettysburg Address at the Rochester Cemetery. By 1936, Charles was the only surviving soldier and was expected to speak on Memorial Day. He was in his 90s and due to ill health could not speak. A Boy Scout volunteered that day and recited the Gettysburg Address for the gathered crowd. He passed away less than a year later on April 13, 1937, at his home at 20 Jackson Street. The front page of the Rochester Courier displayed, "Last Civil War veteran dies." He was 93 years old, and he and his wife just celebrated their 67th wedding anniversary just a month earlier. He was survived by his wife, his daughter Ida, and his son Russell. Funeral services were held at his home on Jackson Street. Burial was in the Rochester Cemetery, and taps were sounded as he was buried with full military honors. With his death, Rochester lost its last direct connection to the American Civil War.
This ends the podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please email bobgriffinpodcast@gmail.com and come back next month for another episode of Rochester, New Hampshire History.